After all of the explanation of who the Egyptians are and their customs, Book 3 begins with Herodotus telling us that Amasis and his son Psammenitus were the kings of Egypt at the time that Cambyses invaded. Apparently, Cambyses had asked Amasis to give him his daughter, which Amasis quietly refused to do, knowing that Cambyses had no intentions of honoring her as his wife. He wanted her to be his concubine instead. He sent him the daughter of Apries, the former king, as a replacement. Or, to be more accurate, a decoy. Her job was to pretend to be Amasis' daughter. This daughter spilt the beans regarding this little scheme, and Cambyses was furious. He decided to launch an attack immediately. Herodotus makes sure that we are aware that Cambyses only asked for Amasis' daughter after his own eye doctor, an Egyptian, suggested it to him. This doctor was trying to get back at Amasis for sending him so far away from home, to Persia. Cambyses is helped by another disgruntled man, Phanes, who had been a mercenary for Amasis. Phanes helps Cambyses find a way into Egypt through the desert, after asking for safe passage from the Arabian king. This agreement included getting a great supply of water, which made the crossing by the army possible. Once again, the common people of little power or account are included by Herodotus in his account, to show how even their actions can cause significant changes in history. Book 2's account of the Egyptian customs includes mention of Egypt being renowned for its specialized doctors, and describes the revolution in which Amasis seized power from Apries, whose daughter ended up telling Cambyses that he had been tricked, no doubt as part of revenge against him. However, things don't end well for Phanes either. The Egyptians knew that he had defected, and so, before battle was joined with the Persians, they made a point of bringing his children out where he could see them to kill them. They also made a show of drinking their blood. This should be a reminder that this is not the same world that you live in. Respect for human dignity and the avoiding of hurting innocent people, these were not always commonly held beliefs. The foundational assumptions held by many of the peoples we encounter through Herodotus are worlds different from ours. I hope. During a battle in the field and a subsequent siege of the city of Memphis, the Persian army makes short work of the Egyptians. The Egyptians also choose to brutally murder and dismember a crew of Persian messengers sent to offer a truce. Cambyses doesn't show himself to be much better. He captures King Psammenitus and the Persian nobles and forces them to watch, as their daughters were brought away to be slaves, and as 10 of their sons were murdered for each dismembered Persian messenger from before. Psammenitus wept not for his family, but for an elderly friend of his, who he saw driven into slavery. On account of this strange reaction, Cambyses has mercy on him. Psammenitus, however, for his part, tried to incite the Egyptians to rebel before long, and killed himself when Cambyses found out. By the way, as an aside, Croesus was present for all of this, and was there as an advisor to Cambyses. The inhabitants of Libya were so intimidated by what happened in Egypt that they immediately surrendered to Cambyses and began sending yearly tribute. But now we begin to see this Persian king's descent into madness. He ordered his men to exhume the body of Amasis and abuse it as much as possible before burning it. Herodotus tells us that this was unthinkable to both the Persians and the Egyptians. In Persia, fire is considered a god to whom it is wrong to present a human corpse, while for the Egyptians it is considered an animal, to which it would be an indignity to give a human body to. This was an act done for retribution alone, with extreme prejudice, even at the cost of violating what should be his own Persian values. It gets worse. King Cambyses' success against Egypt emboldened him to plan to conquer 3 other peoples, the Carthaginians, the Ethiopians, and the Ammonians. The Phoenicians in Cambyses' army, however, refused to fight the Carthaginians. Since they were the best sailors in his navy, Cambyses let the matter slide. He split his land forces in half, however, for the other 2. One was to reduce the Ammonians to slavery and to burn the oracle of Zeus. And then the other half would march against the Ethiopians, but first he sent spies to them. The spies were welcomed by the Ethiopian king, although he knew exactly what they were up to, and told them as much. The Ethiopian king gave the spies a message for Cambyses before allowing them to return to him. He insulted Cambyses and denounced his greed for land and power, and his enslavement of other peoples, and finally gave his spies his own enormous bow to bring to Cambyses with this message. Here is a word of advice. When the Persians can draw bows of this size as easily as I do now, then he can march against the long-lived Ethiopians with an army that considerably outnumbers ours. He should be grateful to the gods for not making the sons of Ethiopia think of acquiring additional lands besides their own. This message sent Cambyses into a fury, and he immediately, with no preparation, marched his army toward Ethiopia, that is, straight into the Sahara Desert. The army quickly ran out of food and animals, and had even turned to cannibalism by the time Cambyses changed his mind and marched them back to Egypt. They had not even made it halfway to their destination. The other half of the army didn't reach its destination either. No one knows what happened to them, but according to the Ammonians, they were most likely all killed in a sandstorm. With his entire army depleted, Cambyses returned to Egypt in disgrace. However, his madness does not stop there. When he arrived in Memphis, in Egypt, he saw that the Egyptians were celebrating the appearance of the god Apis, an appearance, that is, of a calf. Cambyses thought they were celebrating his defeat, and so he began to put the officials of Memphis to death. When he discovered the true reason for the festival, however, he found the calf, stabbed it in the thigh, and ordered that anyone caught celebrating it would be executed. Throughout his time in Memphis, he committed many other sacrileges in all the temples there. He continued to lose his sanity. After a dream in which he was told that someone called Smerdis was sitting on the royal throne in Persia, he had his brother, named Smerdis, murdered in secret by Prexaspes, his most trusted servant. Cambyses married two of his sisters after intimidating the Persian judges into admitting that it was lawful for him to do so, despite it being against Persian customs. One of these wives drew Cambyses' attention to the fact that he had killed his own brother, either in her own grief or by direct confrontation. The accounts vary, and Herodotus reports them both. He killed her without a second thought in response. If this is what he would do to his closest relatives, you can imagine how he'd treat everyone else. But you don't have to. Herodotus tells us. Cambyses then asked his most trusted friend, his most trusted Persian, Prexaspes, what the other Persians thought of him. Prexaspes gave him a flattering answer, but admitted that they thought he drank too much. Cambyses took this to mean that they actually thought he was insane, which would have been correct. To prove his sanity, he shot and killed Prexaspes' son, a cupbearer, right then and there, reportedly running up to the body and admiring his accuracy, saying, "This proves that I am quite sane. Do you know anyone else in the world who can shoot an arrow with such accuracy?" Prexaspes saw that his king was insane, and in fear for his own life admitted that Cambyses was right. This may remind you of the treatment of Harpagus' son back in Book 1. It should. Use that to imagine what might happen next. Croesus, who was still alive, advised Cambyses to take a good look at himself and stop his behavior, or the Persians would surely rise up against him. He was quickly chased out of the room by Cambyses with his bow and arrow, and hid for some time in different corners of the palace to avoid execution. Regarding these antics, but especially those that violate Persian customs, Herodotus says, Cambyses was completely mad. Otherwise he would not have gone in for mocking religion and tradition. If one were to order all mankind to choose the best set of rules in the world, each group would, after due consideration, choose its own customs. Each group regards its own as being by far the best. So it is unlikely that anyone except a madman would laugh at such things. Herodotus then takes us on a short detour through some events going on at approximately the same time near Greece. Polycrates, the tyrant of the island city-state of Samos, a friend of King Cambyses, got invaded by the Lacedaemonians. These are the same as the Spartans. Both Herodotus and I will use the two names interchangeably. Amasis had warned Polycrates that he was too successful, and thus he will surely be met with misfortune later in life unless he takes measures to inflict disaster on himself before the gods do. Remember Solon? Polycrates throws his favorite ring into the sea, but it later appears on his dinner table inside the belly of a fish he was about to eat. King Amasis concludes after hearing this story that Polycrates was fated to die horribly, and ends their friendship, so as to spare himself pain for whenever it happened. The Spartans were, at least partially, attacking Polycrates at the request of some Samians that Polycrates had expelled, those most likely to try to overthrow him as tyrant. It was also, according to them, to avenge a number of thefts they had committed against them. The Corinthians also joined in for revenge for different reasons. The Samians had apparently disrupted a grisly revenge plot of theirs against the children of their enemies. Anyway, the Spartans tried to blockade Samos, but they gave up after a little over a month. Herodotus mentions the Samians because they are renowned for their achievements in the Greek world. I mention his mentioning them because they come back later, time and time again, as do many of these other Greek city-states. While Cambyses was in Egypt, the appointed steward of Cambyses' house in Susa, the Persian capital at the time, plotted to usurp the throne. He and his brother were both magi, Median priests, and this brother of his was named Smerdis. He also happened to look a lot like Cambyses' dead brother of the same name. Since the death of Cambyses' brother had been mostly kept secret, and these two were already in charge of Cambyses' house, they sent messengers throughout the empire declaring that from now on, everyone was to take orders from Smerdis, the son of Cyrus, instead of Cambyses. Cambyses and his servant Prexaspes were present when this messenger made his declaration at Memphis. After interrogating Prexaspes, Cambyses realized that it was this Smerdis, and not his brother, that his dream was warning him about. He had had his brother murdered for no reason. As he attempted to mount his horse to ride back to Persia, the tip of his sword scabbard fell off, and the exposed blade pierced him in the thigh. Herodotus points out that this was the exact same spot that he had stabbed the Egyptian calf god Apis. And just like the calf, Cambyses died from necrosis of his wound in a short time. On his deathbed, no longer insane, he called the highest-ranking Persians in Egypt with him together and told them everything. His dream, his request for Prexaspes to murder his brother, and the scheme of the Magi. He told them to go and take revenge on the two Magi by any means necessary, to prevent power from once more falling into Median hands. He then died. The Persians, however, didn't believe him. Prexaspes was now denying that he had killed Smerdis. The Magi reigned for more than half a year uncontested. The Persian people called Cambyses the Master, for he was cruel and restrictive. Eventually, Otanes, a Persian nobleman, figured out who the rulers of Persia really were, through information given to him from his daughter, at great risk to herself. This daughter was one of the wives of Cambyses, who was then taken by the Magus after the king's death. On orders from her father, she went to the Magus while he was asleep, to check and see if he had any ears. This Magus was known to have lost his ears some years prior as punishment for a crime. Since he had no ears, she wrote to her father and told him the news. Otanes now gathered together a group of 7 conspirators, all noblemen, including Darius, son of Hystaspes, who, remember, Cyrus had dreamt would eventually inherit his kingdom. Darius took control of the conspirators by insisting that they act immediately, or else he would inform on all the rest of them. He also announced that he and the conspirators should happily lie, if required, based on the profit to be gained. If there's no profit to be gained, our truth-teller might as well lie, and our liar might as well tell the truth. As the 7 made their way to the palace, the Magi met with Prexaspes to try to win him over to their side, and to keep him silent about his murder of the real Smerdis. Prexaspes pretended to agree, and went out to the city walls as if to announce what he had promised to, that Smerdis, the son of Cyrus, was alive and well. However, coincidentally, just as the conspirators arrived in the city, Prexaspes publicly praised Cyrus instead, announced the truth about the Magi, and then threw himself off the city walls. The conspirators continued into the palace, lying and forcing their way past the guards as necessary. The Magi were killed and beheaded without a single death amongst their assailants. Their success kicks off a slaughter of every other magus found within the city limits. The 7 conspirators then met to decide what sort of government Persia should have, now that they had control of it. Otanes suggested democracy. Another conspirator, named Megabazus, suggested oligarchy, and Darius suggested monarchy. They each stated their case. This is one of the highlights of the Histories, so I'll include as much of the dialogue as is practical. You have seen how vicious Cambyses became. How can monarchy be an orderly affair when a monarch has the license to do whatever he wants, without being accountable to anyone? A monarch subverts a country's ancestral customs, takes women against their will, and kills men without trial. What about majority rule, on the other hand? Equality before the law, entirely free of the vices of monarchy. It is accountable government, and it refers all decisions to the common people. Otanes' arguments for abolishing monarchy represent my own views too. However, a mob is ineffective, nothing more stupid or more given to brutality. How could anyone know what is right without either having been taught it or having innate awareness of it? Let us leave democracy to Persia's enemies, while we choose a number of the best men and put power in their hands. The best men make the best decisions. I think Cambyses was right in what he said about the masses, but wrong about oligarchy. There are 3 choices before us, and let us suppose that each of them is the best of its kind. The best democracy, the best oligarchy, and the best monarchy. The best monarchy far outstrips the others. If you have a single person, and he is the best person in the world, how could you hope to improve on that? His views are the best. He can govern blamelessly. In an oligarchy, however, violent personal feuds tend to arise. Every one of them wants to come out on top. Factions arise which lead to bloodshed, which leads ultimately to monarchy. Corruption is inevitable in a democracy. The corrupt ones become firm friends rather than opponents. This kind of thing goes on until someone emerges as a champion of the people and puts an end to these corrupt politicians. He wins the admiration of the people and then turns out to be a monarch. We gained our freedom thanks to a single individual. We should keep to this way of doing things. Darius won the majority of the conspirators to his side. They decided to choose a king from amongst them by riding their horses outside before the dawn. The rider of the first horse to neigh after the sunrise will be given the kingship. Darius asked his servant to rig the contest for him the night before. Here's how he did it. This servant took Darius's horse and brought him to see a certain mare, and let them get friendly. He then tied that mare up outside the city. When Darius's horse saw the mare, of course, he neighed, and Darius was crowned the 3rd true king of the Persian Empire. Lies for profit, right? Can't say he didn't warn them. Darius was the first king of Persia to set up fixed rates for taxes on each people in the empire. For this reason, they called him the shopkeeper, because he put a price on everything. Herodotus then details all the different peoples under the Persian Empire, and those from without as well. He remarks that the outer reaches of the world were allotted the most attractive features, just as Greece has gained by far the most temperate climate. He describes other examples of his theory, like Arabia and India, for several paragraphs, along with anecdotes about them. India, for example, has the largest birds and other animals, and an unlimited quantity of gold, and also a much hotter climate. He tells a now infamous anecdote about how Indians gathered gold. Supposedly, they go on expeditions into the desert, looking for giant ants that dig up gold dust in the process of making their burrows. Once they find them, at the hottest part of the day when the ants are asleep in their burrows, they gather as much sand as they can onto their camels and run away. The giant ants smell them, rise to the surface, and chase them. If the crew didn't have a head start running from them, they die. Sounds ridiculous. The crazy part is that it's mostly true, and was explained a few decades ago. An explorer named Michel Picel traveled to the Himalayas in the 90s and discovered large marmots that did, in fact, toss up a lot of gold dust with dirt while digging their burrows. As it happens, the word in the ancient Persian language for marmot translates to Greek as mountain ant. Then there's Arabia, the most southern land, Herodotus thinks, and there can be found rare spices and substances like frankincense, myrrh, cassia, and cinnamon. And also flying snakes. These snakes don't extinguish human life as we know it, according to the Arabians Herodotus spoke to, because the female snakes kill the males during mating, and their young eat their way out from her belly, as Herodotus observes. Divine providence is wise, as one would expect, and it looks as though it has arranged things so that all timid and edible creatures produce young in large quantities, because otherwise they might be eaten into extinction, while all fierce and dangerous creatures produce young in small quantities. Darius dealt with a few internal matters. This involved killing one of the original 7 conspirators for what Darius thought was certainly rebellion, but wasn't, and also by dealing out justice to Orotes. Orotes had tricked and killed Polycrates, the tyrant of Samos, who had finally received the terrible fate Amasis prophesied for him at last. Polycrates had a Greek doctor, Democedes, who was acquired as a slave by Orotes, and was then, subsequently, acquired by Darius after Orotes' execution. He demonstrated his great skill in medicine by treating Darius's sprained ankle. He also treated Atossa, Darius's wife, who had a breast tumor, but asked a favor from her in return. She was to convince Darius to invade Greece instead of Scythia, like he'd been planning, and send the Greek himself to lead the reconnaissance party. Atossa agreed and convinced Darius to send that reconnaissance party. Democedes led his Persian escorts around as promised, but then had them imprisoned once he arrived in a friendly Greek city, long enough for him to escape back home. This is the first event that draws the Persian Empire's attention towards Greece in earnest, all because of a chain of events that included fairly mundane people and actions. Darius sprains his ankle. Democedes just happens to be a slave in Persia at the time. He convinces the queen to goad Darius into sending him to Greece. Once there, he ditches his escort and goes home, and thus Greece is forever on Darius's mind and that of his successors. After capturing Samos, Darius put down a rebellion in Babylon in a most grotesque manner. The Babylonians had killed all of their women to save food for the inevitable siege, and so without some trick or miracle, there was nothing to do but wait them out. However, a Persian noble named Zopyrus promised to deliver him the whole city in a short time, if the king only followed his instructions. Zopyrus mutilated his own face, cutting off his ears and nose, and presented himself to the Babylonians as a deserter from the Persians. They took him in, and he declared himself their ally. On account of the knowledge of Darius's plans he claimed to have, the Babylonians entrusted him to lead an army, which he used on 3 different occasions, spaced out over the course of nearly 40 days, to successfully massacre first 1,000, then 2,000, and then 4,000 troops from Darius's army. They apparently did not notice that each of these soldiers they killed had nothing more than a dagger to defend himself. This was arranged by Darius, who followed Zopyrus' instructions in his little scheme to the letter. The Babylonians at this point trusted Zopyrus so much that they gave him the keys to the gates of the city, which Zopyrus opened wide for the Persians. Darius demolished Babylon's gates, impaled most of its nobles, and ordered all surrounding peoples to send in a quota of women to replace those the Babylonians had killed. He then held Zopyrus to be the Persian who had performed the single greatest act of service to the empire, and was rewarded for it. We have many small actors affecting big changes through their actions. Cambyses' eye doctor, unnamed, sets events in motion for Cambyses to conquer Egypt. The disgruntled mercenary, Phanes, ensures the Persians' passage across the desert, and the doctor Democedes turns the Persians' attention towards Greece forever. Otanes' daughter, the wife of the Magus, is responsible for providing the critical intelligence that brings Darius to power, while Prexaspes ends up winning the people to Darius' side through his revelation from the walls. Zopyrus' self-mutilation ends up destroying the Babylonian rebels. But at what cost does each of these great changes come? There are as many reversals of fortune amongst these figures as there are amongst the rulers, not to mention terrible violations of human dignity, done in the name of revenge or at the behest of one's monarch. Democedes is taken from Samos and enslaved twice by 2 different Persians before Darius requires his services as a physician. Phanes' children are killed in front of him before the battle near Memphis. I suppose it's a good thing for that eye doctor's family that the Egyptians didn't know about his role in the invasion. King Amasis may be the only figure to successfully pass Solon's test, as he dies before Cambyses' army arrives. But Cambyses does mutilate his corpse and either kill or enslave all of his descendants. Prexaspes also loses his son in Cambyses' fits of rage, despite being the one the king trusted the most. The king can do no wrong. In the invasion of Egypt, we see that one does not have to be a monarch to commit atrocities. The common people are capable of them too. However, as seen with Cambyses, the difference with the monarch is that he cannot be stopped. Many Egyptians were forced to pay dearly for those crimes that a few of them committed. Cambyses, however, could not be slowed down. Not by the law, as seen with the Persian judges, not by his closest relatives, not his most trusted servants and advisors, and not even by respect for his own customs, his own gods. No one can oppose him, or they will die. In Herodotus' reading of events, it is the gods that have to intervene. Cambyses dies, but not before he shows himself a victim of the other vice most of Herodotus' rulers tend to have: overconfidence despite compelling evidence of impending failure. We are told during the march into the desert against the Ethiopians, Cambyses would have avoided disaster had he turned around once the pack animals had been eaten. But he doesn't. Herodotus is clear that he chooses to ignore the situation until his own life is in peril. Speaking of the Ethiopians, though, there are several peoples in Book 3 that show us a different vision of what power can look like. The king of the Ethiopians says, "Your master's behavior is reprehensible. If he were a good man, he would not have wanted to possess any land other than his own, and he wouldn't have enslaved people who have done him no wrong." This could be a difference of outlook on life and on virtue as a king, at least between one ruler and another. It is already the norm for the Median or the Persian rulers to behave in this way, but this Ethiopian king does not share this view. Perhaps it is because of this that the Persian kings frequently overextend themselves into disaster, while others with less imperial or colonial inclinations do not. The impact of such mindsets is visible after the death of Polycrates, the tyrant, as well. Maandrius, who was left in charge, proclaimed a state of equality before the law. He was immediately criticized for not being high-born enough to be their leader. The citizens did not see him offering freedom, they saw a power vacuum. Maandrius realized that if he relinquished power, someone else would set himself up as tyrant, so he stopped thinking of giving it up. Apparently, they did not want to be free. Herodotus believes that this tendency is mirrored in nature, too, as seen in the discourses on Greece, India, and Arabia. Moderation is considered best, just like in the Odyssey. Let's move on to Darius. He's an interesting figure that Herodotus characterizes as motivated by profit. He tells the conspirators to strike quickly so that none of them becomes motivated by profit to inform on all the rest. When the other 6 protest that none of them intend to do that, Darius reveals that he himself will do it if they do not listen to him. Was this projection or confession? Probably both. Since profit is his motivating principle, he says that people would be happy to lie or tell the truth as needed to get it. He's projecting again. We see later that he uses a trick to ensure that he is chosen as Persia's next king. Oh, and then of course, he institutes higher taxes for every territory of the empire. Lies for profit, right? The discussion about different forms of government almost speaks for itself. I'd imagine you wouldn't agree with the conclusion for one reason or another, and I don't think Herodotus necessarily would either, but you ought to consider why you disagree. Where did Darius go wrong? Is there a false premise? An ambiguous term? A non sequitur? You'll have to find it. Plenty of disregard for human life happens under Darius's command as well, especially if we look at the Babylonian rebellion. The Babylonians engage in this too, of course. They've murdered just about all of their women to save food for the upcoming siege. But then, Zopyrus mutilates himself. Darius is appalled by this, and remains so long afterward. But consider, hasn't the precedent already been set? Is Zopyrus not a mere slave of the king? How could he be worth more than the king's success? Either way, Darius is happy to go along with Zopyrus' plan to take Babylon, even though by the end it involves intentionally sending 7,000 of his own men to their deaths completely defenseless. The main takeaways are the same as before. Count no one happy until he is dead. There's always time for things to get better and worse until then. A people's ideas and mindsets about freedom, what human dignity is, slavery, power, and government have direct consequences for how the human person is thought of and treated, by others or by themselves. Consider what ideas about these things you seem to hold implicitly. Watch and see whether you find a greater kinship with the Greeks or the Persians. Powerful men have a tendency to ignore useful information or competing ideas that don't fit their worldview or their view of themselves. It usually leads them to disaster. Small actions by small people can have huge consequences or effects down the road, even on a historical scale. Thanks for watching. Join me next week for Book 4.